I'm Heather. After many wasted years trying outdated approaches to my daughter's addiction that felt wrong to me, harmed our relationship, and didn't help my daughter, I finally found an effective, evidence-based approach that repaired my relationship with her, helped me create my own peace of mind, and made me an ally in my daughter's recovery. I teach you a loving and compassionate approach to help you encourage change and create connection. Addiction impacts the entire family system. Family recovery is the answer. Today's episode features a guest, but it's a conversation rather than an interview. Because of that, the pace is different than a normal guest episode. It's a real-time conversation, and there's some pauses and slower responses. This episode took on a life of its own and changed into what it wanted to be and came out so much better because of that. So during the time that Cordelia and I were planning this episode, a client brought up something really important, and that had a big impact on the direction of our conversation. That client shared with me how it felt to her to hear people say it works when they're talking about invitation to change, or ITC for short, in craft, because their kids are in recovery. So when people say it works because their kids are in recovery, what does it mean if you're practicing craft and invitation to change and your child still struggles with substances? Does that mean that it's not working for you? And the longer I do this work, the more I understand the importance of the language I use and the impact it has. And I course correct when new information changes my perspective, which happens constantly. Every time I'm lucky enough to get in a Zoom room with other people in helping professions who are using craft and invitation to change, I'm really inspired by their work and what I learned from them. And the reason that I get the opportunity to be a part of that community is because today's guest, Cordelia Kraus, spends a lot of her own personal time creating a community for us to come together where we learn from and support each other. It's been helpful to me being an entrepreneur because it's lonely. It's similar to the loneliness parents feel about being the only support that their kids have. And the answer to that is being a part of a community who understands you. But I didn't have that for a long time. When I met Cordelia in a training that she was facilitating last year, I got access to the community that I really didn't know that I needed, but it's where I found my people. People with similar beliefs who want to help families, and being around them really, it energizes and inspires me and makes it easier for me to serve more families. So today's guest, Cordelia Kraus, LPC CADC, became passionate about working with families struggling with their loved one's substance use after going through her own experience as a mom. Cordelia has been a part of what is now CMC Foundation for Change, Invitation to Change training team since 2016. She completed the craft clinician certification process through Dr. Robert Myers and Associates in 2018 and has been a facilitator for both Smart Recovery and Smart Recovery Family and Friends. In 2019, she took over what is now helpingfamilieshelp.com, a website that connects families with craft-based resources and offers community and support for the providers who serve them. She has a private practice in Portland, Oregon. So some action steps that you can take after listening to this episode is to check out helpingfamilieshelp.com and become a part of the change. Families can, if they are willing, not only do the work for themselves within their own families, but become a part of the change by letting others who are struggling know there are evidence supported options available for them to learn skills and perspectives that can make a difference in their home. If they find this work helpful for themselves, they can raise awareness just through the conversations they have with other families, friends, pediatricians, doctors, clinicians, recovery centers, hairstylists, clergy, whoever's interested, and spread the awareness that families need empowerment and support too. And there is an existing path that can help. I hope you enjoy today's episode. All right. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast today, Cordelia. I appreciate you making time for us.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Heather.
So let's start with you sharing about the Helping Families Help website, like what it's all about, what people can learn from it.
Sure, absolutely. So helpingfamilieshelp.com is a website that tries to connect families with craft-based resources. So I absolutely love craft and craft-based work. And one of my frustrations as a clinician was that I couldn't find places to really point families towards so they could actually see this in a little bit of a bigger picture and choose for themselves about what might be best fit. And so a few years back, I was sort of handed this website out of where I wasn't quite expecting it. And I'm really incredibly grateful for the opportunity to have taken it and run with it. Because that's what came out of it, is a place to be able to point families towards ways that they can find community reinforcement and family training based work through books and websites and podcasts and trainings and events and groups. And it's almost like this hub that you can go to that points towards other people that are offering the work.
Yeah, I love that. And then there's a little bit about each person that's offering the work on there to help make the choice easier, and all the invitation to change meetings are on there.
Yes. So there's the part of it is a provider directory for folks that are interested in being listed, that are open to having open to having families reach out to them and connect with them and work with them. There's many, many different groups. Invitation to Change is a lot of them. Many of them are offered for free, which is phenomenal. There's actually events that are listed on a separate page. Events are more one-time offerings. So either classes that are happening, like right now, there's a limited time sort of book club that's happening with Beyond Addiction. It is an example. There's a few different studies that they're recruiting participants for. That's on the events page. And then the ongoing groups are groups that you can just drop into that are just, ongoing. Week after week, month after month, you'll find them there.
Yeah, it's a great resource. And I love because if somebody asks me, like, do you know somebody that works with partners instead of parents, then right. It's so nice to just be able to send them to that website and have them look around instead of me trying to go out and find somebody that I know works with craft and ITC that also works with partners.
Yes. Yeah. And on the resources side, on the books and websites, you can actually look, like check on parents and have it show up, or check on partners, and only books. I'm only interested in books, and have it sorted in that way. And I'm looking forward to, as the site progresses, this is actually sort of a site that I run on the side, if you will, just as a hobby. So I'm hoping I can start carving out more time to be able to support things and have things a little bit easier to find. And yet for right now, I think it works well enough to be able to help point families in a direction that would be helpful to them. And if you can't find what you're looking for, just shoot us an email. Carrie and I work really hard to match family members with resources that would make the best sense for them in their situation. So if it just feels like too much, no worries at all. Just send us an email and we'll let us know what's happening for you, whether you're a partner or a parent or sibling, and where you're located, and we can find some resources that might be a really good fit.
Yeah, that's great. I love what that website offers. And I wish it had been around like 10 years ago, or is searchable. Yes. That's the hard thing somebody brought up in one of the Invitation to Change groups, was that if you don't know the right terms to search when you're looking for help, that you just happen to luckily run into something about Beyond Addiction or Invitation to Change or craft, but it doesn't really come up if you're just searching, how do I help my kid that's struggling with substance use?
Right. because there's so much history of the more confrontational or detachment-based approaches that are out there that Google will find in their database for sure. There's also another quick side to helping families help I'd love to point towards in case it's helpful as well. That there's the other piece of it is also support for providers who are interested in learning more about the work. So it offers community and support, either both for providers that are doing the work, but also anybody who's interested in even learning more. So for families out there who are listening, if you're working with a therapist, if you're working with a pediatrician, doctor, whoever you are working with, if they want to learn more about craft or hear more about it from the provider side, this is also a great place to send them, because we have this phenomenal community that is set up to be able to learn more and support more, and lists of trainings and events and consultation groups and such.
That's great, because I have had parents ask before, like, well, what if my doctor or counselor or psychiatrist doesn't know about craft, doesn't agree with the way I'm approaching things? Then they could send them to the website to...
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great.
And again, have them reach out to me. And I would love to talk with them more, phone conversation, Zoom call, like get as much of this information out to the providers that are working with families as well, to help them understand the base behind the science base that's behind this, and what this work does and what it looks like. Yeah.
Okay. That's great. So before this, Cordelia and I talked a little bit about, we're going to do like a traditional interview, and I had all the questions written out, but then we got into a conversation about what it means when we hear it works, as far as talking about craft or invitation to change. And it's really easy to say it works without explaining that further, or people having different definitions of what it works means. Mm-hmm. So we thought we would go a little bit into talking about what's behind, like, the craft research that shows that when you're using craft, 70% of loved ones seek treatment, and what that really means. And then I've had people ask me, well, what about if you're in the 30%? What does that mean about your family? And so we thought we would just talk about these really important parts of, let's start with what it works means to you, and then I'll add to it as we go.
Sure. And that question is such an important question, I think, to look at. I'm so excited that you're having this conversation, because that's one of those comments that there's an assumption around it that gets sort of really, really slippery. That's not very helpful. So to me, when we're looking at even what that means, I have to look at what it is that we're talking about and really slow down. So we can talk, and it sounds like we will talk about the craft-based research and what it works means in that context. For invitation to change, is going to be a little bit different, I think. There's a bit of a different intention that's there. So for me, and I'd actually be really super curious to have this conversation with the folks that created it. So Doctors Jeff Foote, Carrie Wilkins, and Ken Carpenter, Nicole Kasienke. But as I'm doing this work, what I'm looking for is the potential for increased connection between the loved one who's struggling with substance use and the family members. So increased, better communication, increased connection. Looking for, ideally, we might see some recovery type behaviors out of the loved one. That may not mean they stop using, but that might mean harm reduction. That might mean they're reaching out with friends a little bit more. That might mean that doing a little bit more self-care around seeking out services or wound care, or just connecting with people, services, community, something. I'm also looking for, and this is, we can unpack this term a bit more if it's helpful, but looking for more psychological flexibility within the parents or within the families as well, so that they can navigate this really, really difficult situation in a way that is based on their values, that they can continue to practice these skills and processes in ways that they feel good about. And that might be regardless of what happens with a loved one's response. So for me, those are the big three things that we're looking for. And actually, when I'm talking about recovery on the second one, I'm looking for that not only from the loved one, but from the family member as well. Are they getting more connected with friends? Are they taking care of themselves a little bit more? Are they seeking services for themselves? So,
yeah. Before you said that about connection, I had just written it down when I was thinking, like, for me, what it works means has always been that focus on connection and the healing that can happen really at any stage. Like, that was, I think, one of the most surprising things to me was that my daughter and I started healing before she got into recovery.
yes.
And I
Wow.
think that there's a lot of despair about thinking that there's no way healing can happen until somebody does get into recovery. And if it seems like they're not headed that way, that you'll never have connection.
Well, absolutely. And that is such a huge thing. And I'm actually really curious, and and I apologize if you've gone into this other places with your podcast, please let me know. But I'm really curious about what you saw. If there's an example that you have about what that healing might have looked like for you.
Oh, there's so much.
Yeah, I'm sure. And if it doesn't feel...
No, I think for
curious.
the most part, the healing was us seeing each other, giving each other grace. We were both judging each other so much and really focused on our differences and coming from a lot of fear and anger for both of us. And then moving into the vulnerability of showing up from a place of love and rather than responding to fear all of the time. And there was a lot of healing in me also stopping trying to control the situation, like letting her move out. She was almost 18. I ended up letting her move out like a month before just because I knew that keeping her, like forcing her to stay at home was destroying our relationship. Yeah. So I knew that there would like build a lot of goodwill between us. So it was just like, and really acceptance of her, like as she was.
Yes.
Not wanting her to be the old Helena, not wanting her to be who I envisioned she would be in the future, but sitting there, head and showered, really hurting, all the things, like just loving and accepting that person.
Yes.
That was really the biggest healing for both of us, and her feeling that level of acceptance from me and me not needing anything from her anymore. And of course, that came from me also healing myself, focusing on working through my emotions and how that was feeling, like recognizing that it was my responsibility, even though I was having feelings about her life and what she was doing, and they were still my responsibility to process first.
Yes. And there's something that as you're talking about that is so powerful to me, that reflects of my personal experiences as a mom and doing this work, but also in what I actually see and how I see this play out, is that to me, it was almost this ownership. There's a point where I recognized I could not control what was happening. And yet I still needed to show up and do what I could do and practice what I could practice to feel that I was doing what I could. And so this it feels to me almost like bringing in of resources to be able to really just focus on myself and my practice. And yet, so all of that work it takes to soften my face and find some warmth in seeing my loved one, even though it was a really, really difficult time, finding those ways to be able to appreciate them and love on them just for who they were. Initially having that just be for me. And yet there's also something in there that starts to ripple. But very often, it doesn't always. And that's the tricky thing. And even if it didn't change the dynamics in my home, it would have changed the dynamics within me. And that absolutely matters.
Yeah.
I very often see that there are changes then that happen between, but even there, I want to be careful because we can't control that either. All I can do is simply practice what I can.
Yeah. And that's the other part of it works for me too, is me being proud of how I show up.
Yes.
And feeling good about myself every day instead of feeling like a failure, not a good enough mom, really wanting to show up with love and support, but not knowing how. First, I mean, this really is something that's always stuck with me is she got arrested. She was like 15 or 16. And it was like really early on realizing something's going on here and I can't figure out what it is yet. And she got arrested for stealing diet pills. And the police called me and I was with a friend and he said, what she really needs right now is your love. She doesn't need discipline right now. And I wanted to do that so bad, but I was so scared that I ended up angry. Like I didn't know how to work to handle my fear about it and show up with love at the same time. And so once I finally did get that, and I could be afraid and not know what to do, I could override that and show up with love and support anyway.
Yeah. But those, to my perspective, those are skills. Like that is practice. It's not something that just comes. That's hard work. Like what you're talking about is hard, dedicated work on the part of, the family member to be able to practice showing up in that way. And it might start with, I'm going to practice this while I'm driving with a person that's, driving 10 miles below the speed limit in front of me and trying to appreciate. And I don't know them as, that might be the places that we start with. Can I find compassion for the person that's next to me that can't pick out broccoli in the supermarket and they keep on handling all the, like whatever, can I try to understand how that might make sense for them, that they might have something that they're worried about, whatever this looks like, where it's a tiny different spaces. And then we can, but those are all skills and it's hard work. And I think it's incredibly meaningful work, absolutely worthwhile. But
yeah, those are great examples of the person driving slow or the person, because there's always that person in the supermarket that you can't get around. It's right in front of what you need. But it is hard work. And that I was really dedicated to it because I didn't want to feel how I felt anymore. So I could either go through the discomfort of learning these new skills and changing. And it's like lifting weights at the gym. I don't know why, it's okay to hire a personal trainer or to know that you shouldn't be able to just run a marathon. But for some reason, when it comes to emotional or mental health, we don't realize how hard we have to work at it. So I appreciate that you pointed that out.
Yes, absolutely. And that it's a day, just like either of those, it's this ongoing practice. Like one doesn't run a marathon even after 2 months of, there's this longer term buildup to this.
I was just going to say, it was funny to me because I had a friend who ran marathons. And I was surprised to find out that once you ran one, you couldn't just go run one again. You had to train again if you didn't keep it up. And so that was great to point out that it's the same, that it's just like losing that physical strength if you don't keep working at it.
Yes.
So to summarize, it works. I think we both agree that it works doesn't always mean somebody getting into recovery. It means liking how you show up, showing up with your values, and focusing on connection.
So tracking that sense about that I am, for me as a parent, that I have showed up in a way that I feel proud about. So my loved one, for a little while, it was my loved one wasn't coming downstairs very often. So I made it my job that every time that they came downstairs, I would look up from whatever I was doing. And, not glom on them, but try, can I relax my face? Can I show some warmth? Can I say it's good to see you? Can I maybe offer a snack? But super low key. That was my job, right? And it was really hard. It sounds a little bit funny to me, but it was actually really hard work on some days. And then they would eventually go back upstairs. And for me, I felt proud of myself that I showed up and I paid attention to, and that's the closest part of it works. I think that matters.
Yeah.
That this hard situation happened and I practiced the skill there and I tried the skill and I feel good about myself for having tried the skill. That's the first part of this. Then there's a second part of it, which very often, on the coming downstairs, or trying to ask open-ended questions. I might ask 20 open-ended questions in a space of a week and maybe 1 or 2 of them get answered. But even in that time, that 1 or 2%, there's a little bit more connection. So it creates these possibilities for the loved one to be able to respond differently. And I think there's a little bit of it works in there as well. But again, we're starting to sort of go outside the reach of what we can actually choose. So I want to be really, really light and really respectful about that there's no guarantees. That the only thing I can actually decide on is what I practice, what I can do.
Yeah, I like that. Oh, I'm sorry. That focusing on trying rather than perfecting, right?
Yes.
Like it works means I tried the skill, not that then that it's going to be a process of figuring it out over time. Right. And I laughed when you said that it's super low key, how you would respond when your loved one came downstairs, because it's so easy to get like needy, creepy, and weird and just be really, like, oh, yes. You're downstairs. What can I do? Like all over them.
Or it's about time you came downstairs, or it's good to see you this month, or, whatever. Like it's all these different things that would show up in my head. Or now that I'm seeing you, I have to tell you about the 4 things,
Yeah, that agenda.
And great. And for some reason, they keep on going back up to the room. Like, I can't figure it out. Or can I just like soften and create space and create warmth? And it's super hard.
Yeah. All of this it is.
Yeah.
And just even having the kindness and compassion for yourself that you just tried the skill and maybe it didn't work out like you expected, but that doesn't mean that you did it wrong.
Yeah.
It's just part of the process.
There's a memory that's showing up for me about my own work in this, if that's okay to share, if it's helpful.
Please.
That there's a few different points for me that really help switch my stance. And one of them was in a more of a therapeutic setting where I was talking about my struggles and talking about, I put the story before, but how it was for me to feel like I was trying to pin my eldest to the ground in a way. Most of the time it was figuratively. Sometimes, that actually happened. And the struggle with trying to control. And the therapist that I was working with asked me to sort of get physically in a position of what that would look like. And so I did. And then asked me about what would my eldest appreciate if we got through this okay, what is it that they would appreciate that I would have done? And I came to this place of that I was a safe place to come back to. And then they asked me what that position would look like. And I sat on the floor with my hands sort of palms up on my knees, just waiting. And then she did the most powerful and probably one of those brutal things ever. And she had me sit there, just stay in that position for a while. And I'm sitting there, it's just coming up now. Like I'm sitting there like sobbing. Like it feels so much easier to feel like I'm being actively like sitting in that position of safety and that I'm a safe place to come back to. And there's time like in that I want to do anything, but it was so hard and yet so helpful for me to recognize, number one, that I could hold that position and that it was an important position for me to hold, whether or not they actually came back. And that it was really, really hard. Like both of those pieces became touchstones for me later. So that's like the heart of the way it works. Like that's what that means to me.
I love that. Yeah, I could feel that waiting and how vulnerable and hard that is and not knowing how they're going to respond. But again, going back to how good it feels to know that you're holding that space for them.
Because it's not like there's this really active stance of watching and noticing and waiting and appreciating and practicing my own care and seeing if I could notice little bits of what there's the whole stance is ongoing practice that reaches towards connection, but with an open hand. So without grasping.
Yeah. And I was just thinking of a funny story one time where it worked for me that was like something completely unusual, which was leaving my daughter in a parking lot one day. She was, I don't know why we were there, but we were at a gas station and she was just really confrontational that day. And I could tell the state she was in that I couldn't stop it. And it was going to turn into something. And I ended up leaving her in the parking lot at the gas station. I knew that there were friends nearby that she could walk to. And that was it working that day. That was the very best thing that I could do for both of us. Cause all I could picture was like, we're going to end up on the news because she's going to she's going to get physical and I'm just going to have to lay on her and like, and somebody's going to be videotaping it in the parking lot. Right. So I'm like, the best thing I can do is just leave her in this parking lot right now. That's it working in that situation. It doesn't always look great.
Yes. But you ended up with a better situation. It sounds like it was a hard decision to make.
Yeah. And I played it all the way through. That, I guess that was a big part of it too, was seeing like not being in the fear of, I can't leave my daughter in this parking lot, but playing it all the way through. Well, what's going to happen if I don't?
It also sounds like the stance, I think, matters here too, because the other part that could be seen is, well, I'm going to show her. She can't talk to me this way. I'm just going to leave. Yeah, and then that's not what we're talking about either, right? This is I love you, but it's not safe for us to be in the same car anymore.
Yeah, and it was great to point out. Because it easily could have been that, or the feeling that I should do that for that reason, when really it was because it was really the kindest, most loving thing for both of us in that moment.
Absolutely. So it's not about a struggle for control anymore, or I'll show her, or I'll make her, like any of those things. And I so much appreciate you pointing out that for you in that moment where you're figuring out this is the most kindest and loving thing I can do right now. And she is safe and she has places to go. This is for what's happening. This is what I can do.
Yeah. So before we move on to talking about craft a little bit more and the numbers that go with the research, is there anything else that you want to share about It Works?
Yeah, one of the things I track, and I'm really curious about, like as the study is around this, I'm hoping there'll be, we'll start getting randomized control studies around invitation to change here as it's being more developed. Part of this question around the studies is even what we're tracking, right? One of the things that I track personally, whether they would choose to track it as a study or not, is almost this ripple effect of what happens. Like one of the things I really notice is when families, including myself, offer skills, open-ended questions, curiosity, respect, reflective statements, understanding statements, that eventually we actually start hearing those same skills coming back from the loved one, right? Doesn't mean they went to treatment, doesn't mean that they're not still using, doesn't mean that there's not some other difficult things that are going on. But some of that environment, that stance that's being offered by the family member, one of the other sort of, again, I want to hold this lightly because it can't control this one. But what I watch for is, does it start rippling back? Because very often it does. Small little ways. I love you, Mom. Sometimes that phrase, when it hasn't been heard in months and months, it's amazing. And that's part of what I'm listening for. So does it work not only within the family member, but is it working to make other possibilities for connection and care happen between?
Yeah. As you were sharing that, I was thinking about how that started reflecting back with my daughter. Like the first thing was she let me hug her. She hadn't let me hug her in so long. Yeah. And that was a huge, and then she started calling me. And then it was even managing my mind around the phone calls, because they went to like, what does she want? Why is she calling me? And then I was like, I started calling it the investigator. I was like, the investigator is going to get in the middle of our relationship. It doesn't matter what she wants. She's actually calling me. And then listening when she called and not being so needy, creepy, and weird that I just took over the conversation. And so like those were the really early stages of her reflecting that back to me, that what I was doing was being well received.
Yes. And so well received that she's starting to emulate, like where she's actively doing them back. And again, they can be tiny. And I love that you picked up on that, because that's also the pieces here that when we're talking about some of the reinforcement skills, being able to notice that, appreciate those small moments in ways that would be meaningful to them. So that's, if we can just start tracking that and even noticing that, then it actually becomes like exponentially even more likely to happen. Yeah. Without being, as you say, needy, creepy, and weird.
I like that term because you can't say it without laughing, and it just brings a little, comic relief to such an intense situation sometimes.
That speaks to me for sure. Because didn't quite use those words in my head, but I will now. Because it's hard to manage, and that's really what we're sort of asking for. And then, which actually points towards that third piece of this, that for me, when I talked a little bit before about the psychological flexibility, and to me, and this is what comes from the acceptance commitment therapy side of stuff with an invitation to change, but also for the internal work that I do, is that however I'm showing up in this resonates, with me in ways that I can continue to practice in the presence of really hard thoughts and emotions and urges to be needy, creepy, and weird. Right. Because that's all. And so I love what you were talking about, recognize the investigator is going to be there. She'll be present, but she doesn't run the show. You're able to operate from this other place and show up in a different way. Yeah. And that's that flexibility, that internal flexibility to orient towards what's important. And to me, when we're talking about this, like that is one of the most important, I don't know, they're all important, but one of the most important pieces of it works, because that's the one that's really, really housed in if the worst were to happen. Yeah. And our loved one dies. Like how will I look back on how I showed up?
Yeah, and that's a gift.
That's the part. And again, almost like it works becomes almost too of a black and white yes or no phrase in there. It sort of dissolves to me. But having that sense of connection, like watching people who have followed this path and then have had the worst happen and still have, what feels, at least from me and watching you and others who have done this, is that your feet are on the ground and you know where your heart is. Yeah. And
you can't replace, there's so many things about it that are so hard, but there's this gratitude that I lived my life really, that I was willing to do the work, that even though it was hard, there were times like when I didn't like what I saw in myself, and it would have been easier to go back to just living kind of a numb existence, that I went through that river of misery of seeing things that I didn't like in myself and making those changes, and the gift that it gave me in return of maximizing every minute of the short 21 years that I had with my daughter, and knowing that she felt so loved and supported by me and accepted no matter what. And I believe that it has helped my grief, that I can always go back to that, because, my brain wants to be a jerk all the time and look at all the reasons, all the things that I did wrong. But I can always bring myself back to that I did the very best I could and I did the work, and that I know beyond a doubt that she felt loved and supported by me, and that our very last conversation could have been so different than it was, because I got really angry after she called me and told me that she had had a lapse. But I knew that it was mine to manage. Mm-hmm. So I never lashed out at her. And so things could have been so different. And that's really this also, it works for us as parents too.
Yes. And to me, that's actually the most powerful of all the it works, because that's with so much that's not within our control. Like that's the part. I know we sort of talked about this at the beginning, but Pamela Leonhardt from Thrive Recovery Family Resources, I believe, talks about this sense about doing this work and not having that sense of what if. Like she knows, as you said, that her child felt respected and connected and loved. There's no doubt about that she did that which what she could. And for me, as a parent, there is always this thought. My loved one's alive now, but one of actually the other points of work for me is the thought this one might not make it. And what do I do with that? Or family members that I'm working with. And that is for all of us, is a real possibility.
Yeah, for anybody at any time.
For anybody at any time, yes. And so that to me is almost the deepest level. And that at the part when I need to, that's the part I'll back up into. That's most powerful for me, is that it works. And again, there's almost like this, I don't have words around this part of it, but there's a sense of groundedness there, a sense of being able to hold what matters, feet on the ground, where heart is. And that's the greatest part of it works from my perspective.
I agree. And I hear more parents thinking about that, not from a place of fear, right? Because initially that's the fear that if
Right.
that something happens and their child dies, but it's more about, I want to like how I showed up no matter what happens.
Yes.
And that is a great change in the way we're looking at things rather than coming from fear.
Yes, absolutely. There's that question that was asked of me is if everything goes well and they're looking back, what is it that they would have appreciated? And I use that question sometimes. Sometimes in Invitation to Change, we talk about it as the 80th birthday question, right? Birthday celebration, loved one stands up. What would they have appreciated? But there's the flip side of that question, was if the worst were to happen in 20 years from now, you are looking back at this time now. What is it that you would feel proud of yourself or appreciative of yourself for doing in this space?
Love that exercise. It's so valuable.
Yeah.
So now we talked a little bit about, well, before this, you guys didn't hear this part yet. But we talked a little bit about like what evidence-based means.
Yeah.
And then that shiny number of craft, meaning talking about how 70% of loved ones seek treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And I shared that I don't use that number anymore because I feel like there's just so much that needs to be said along with it. When I first found it, I was so impressed I was using it.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I was like, what? People need to know this.
Huge.
And then I thought, okay, wait a minute, back down, Heather.
Right.
Like, that's not the only thing to focus on. And that there's a lot in that number.
Yes.
So do you want to share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So when we're looking at even, and I'm not a researcher, so I'm sure there are much better definitions out there. But for me, when we're looking at what evidence-based generally means, is that there's an approach that it has some very, very clear and very often operationally defined goals that are out there that can be measurable. Right? And when this approach is done, that when compared with other people who are in a different group that aren't doing that approach, that whatever those goals are, happen for the group that's doing that approach at a statistically significant amount more than the control group that was doing like treatment as usual. And that there's lots of studies like this. So it's called a randomized control trial, and that there's lots of different studies that show this again and again and again. So when we're talking about evidence-based practice, that's what we're looking at. So it's not like a clinician that's thinking, well, I think that, I don't know, butterfly therapy might be a really lovely thing. I don't even know if that's a thing or not, but so I'm going to bring butterflies, I know, in my office, and because it feels right. That might be a really helpful thing, but we don't actually know because it hasn't been put through the trials for lots of different people and lots of different contexts and seen again and again and again. So the thing about craft is there is this incredibly shiny, big and shiny number that approaching 70% of loved ones whose family members practice craft will enter into treatment. How that is specifically defined within the studies, at least the ones that I'm aware of, because there's lots of studies, but is that the loved one went in for an intake and they showed up to one session afterwards. Doesn't mean that they completed treatment. Doesn't even mean that they went in for 2 or 3 sessions, but they entered into the intake and they went into one actual meeting with a clinician or the treatment center afterwards. So when we're talking about starting or entering into treatment, I think there's a lot of hope. That's difficult around there, that this means that this will change everything. Treatment is the be all end all. If they just get into treatment, they'll be fixed. And that's not even what we're talking about with craft. It's just, and to point out, actually, in a lot of the research studies, the treatment was right around the corner in the building behind. So if the loved one finally said, yeah, I'd be interested in doing that, we just had to walk them around to the back of the building. Super easy access. The loved ones are guaranteed access into treatment. And that is not how the world works at all. So the part I actually think that's really, really helpful about that 70% shiny number is the recognizing that family members practicing these skills do have influence on their loved ones a lot of the time. And that's the part that we see over and over and over again. If we practice these skills, and actually really specifically the invitation to treatment conversation might be, and some communication skills are actually really all that's needed, that we do have influence. We have this potential to be able to have a person say yes. Is that going to solve all the problems? It is definitely not. And that's where, to me, where we actually start looking at some of the other things. Then I'm not actually just talking about treatment. I'm talking about connection. I'm talking about family dynamics. I'm talking about reduction of harm. I'm talking about the loved or the family member getting re-engaged in their own life as much as possible. The psychological flexibility, like that is what plays out over time to me. Those are longer term goals. And so I really do appreciate that 70%, but not for what it's, I think it's a little bit of a, not for what it, there's almost like a little fantasy that's wrapped up in there. Like we absolutely see those numbers, but it doesn't translate to what we might hope it would translate to in the real world.
So it doesn't translate to happily ever after.
No, excellent way to put it. No, no. The other things that we do see out of craft is that if the family members continue to do the work, is that there's a reduction of substance use over time, not abstinence, but reduction. We see the family members' well-being themselves increase. And in some of the studies have shown, even though it's not a goal of craft, has shown that the loved ones will actually maintain treatment for longer as well. And all of those, like that's actually one of the ones I get most excited about, that the family members are doing better. Reduction sort of nice. Maintaining a treatment is longer, just because I see that as an activity of recovery. But to my mind, if somebody is connecting more with their community and maybe going to groups of some kind that fit really well with them, or reaching for a peer mentor, or practicing harm reduction approaches, or starting to volunteer someplace. I mean, there's so many different ways that recovery could look like. They're starting to go to a class of some kind, or whatever. They're taking walks outside there. Like, I get excited about all of that.
Yeah.
So
I want to read from the psychosis reach training that we did. I wrote down the definition of recovery and the way they said it. And I thought, when you just brought that up, so they say recovery is a process of change where individuals improve their health and wellness and live a self-directed life and strive to reach their full potential. Living well, even if symptoms persist, we achieve this by finding out what matters to a person and how to start moving in the direction of their preferences. This is why we emphasize reduction in distress from troubling experiences, so people can engage more with their life preferences. 5 processes relevant to recovery are represented with the acronym CHIME: connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, or a sense of meaning, living a meaningful life, and empowerment.
Yeah.
And that is just such a heartwarming definition of recovery, because it drops all these expectations of perfection and is really focused on the person who is getting into recovery, what they want, not what we want. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of emphasis on what they want.
Yes. Yes. Is this for the path to be walkable for them? It has to make sense to them. And there's this also then parallel process that starts coming up too with, I can start working on my own increased well-being, basically my own recovery. The points of time work for me as well. It works for any of us.
Yeah. That's such an important part of the process, is that we're doing the same thing that we want our loved ones to do. Like, I remember when I had that realization of like the things that I expected my daughter to do, I didn't even know how to do myself. And that was a real eye-opening moment.
Totally. Right. Yes. No, absolutely.
And I set out to learn those things. And by taking the steps to learn those things, like what I really wanted in life, what mattered to me, how to feel my own emotions, gave me a lot more respect for the process that she was going through and what she was going to have to do, and a lot more compassion just about how hard change is in general, meeting them in that process.
Yes, for sure.
And some of what you were talking about earlier brought up, I was thinking about like sustainability of how we're approaching things, that showing up in a way that we can continue to do. And if we're not taking care of ourselves, then it's not sustainable. I found myself so burned out, not taking care of myself and focused on control instead of influence, and really having to just build this whole new relationship with all my expectations about recovery, that it wasn't this one-time event and then everything was going to be okay, because I had all of those expectations as well as this huge drive to get her into treatment at any cost, because then everything would finally be okay. And I would be okay. Yeah.
Yep.
And then the realization that's just like one stop.
Yeah. And I'm also afraid to say this, but part of this might be just from my own experience, but for me, there's this also realization that back to normal for me would have been in this situation that actually wasn't healthy for my own. So that there's things that I needed to do to show up differently. There is no back to normal. Like I would not back to normal. When I think about what normal was, like those are the pictures of beforehand that I have a real hard time looking at now, because I think of all the ways that I showed up that I thought were the right thing. And this is what a good mom does. That sort of turned my stomach now because I didn't know better. And this process taught me.
Yeah. And for me, back to normal, when I was the same thing. Like I thought that a lot. Like I just want to go back to the way things were before, without realizing the implications of that for my daughter too. She was showing up. She looked happy on the outside, but she wasn't on the inside.
Right.
And for me to want to go back to that wasn't working for her. Yes. And it really wasn't working for me either. I just wasn't as aware as she was.
Absolutely. No, I like myself so much better now.
Yeah. Me too.
Like as a human being, holy cow. Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And yet that even awareness about that other person's path, about the loved one's path and what is meaningful to them. And, what does that look like? And is there a way that it can make that easier? That could help? Can I notice the small changes, the 1%, 2% changes? I mean, just in all of these pieces that start pulling out of the work of invitation to change for craft-based approaches, where it is that recognition that, one size, the behaviors make sense and one size doesn't fit all. And can I really step into that with understanding and respect and starting to let go of my own expectations, which also meant all that kind of crap that was in my head about a good mom should be able to control this. If I was a good mom, my child wouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z.
Any thought that starts with "if I was a good mom" is probably not good. I had a lot of those too. Not good.
Yeah. No, it's really unhelpful. So I'm orienting then towards this fantasy and as you're saying, not the person that's in front of me, not my child.
I remember realizing one day this was after I had made a lot of changes, and she came out here to live after she had gone to treatment, and we were out to lunch and she didn't like her food. And I just had this really clear knowing that before this, I would have made it about me. And I would have been thinking things like, I can never make her happy. Now I've got to order her another meal and I'll make all this stuff mean all these things about me that are really painful, which would have created disconnection. We wouldn't have had a good time together. None of the stuff I had intended before that would have happened.
Right.
But then I just suddenly had this realization of oh my gosh, I'm making all these assumptions here. It's just food that she doesn't like. Right. So I said, well, do you want something else to eat or do you want some of mine? And it was that simple. And we stayed connected.
Right.
But if I had let those thoughts go on made it all about me.
Right. Yeah.
Would have pushed her away.
Yeah. And yet you're at least when I'm tracking skills there, the sense of oh, that's too bad. It's hard to order something and then not want it. What do you want to do? Right? Would you like some of mine?
Yeah.
I mean, and it's just, and then she's got choices. There's a collaboration that starts happening then between the two of you. Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of it all being in my head, all my fault, all my responsibility.
Yep. I've got to fix this. Yeah.
And I love that awareness piece. That's why I love the way the wheel works with the invitation to change, that, the awareness comes before the behavior tools, because it makes it so much easier to implement when you have that awareness and understanding beforehand.
And to my mind, it's really hard to figure out even where to step into me, because it's all there, right? That we definitely need the awareness before the behavioral tools, definitely need the understanding before the behavioral tools. Sometimes it's going to be helpful to lean into the behavioral tools as a practice to see what happens afterwards so we can raise the awareness and the understanding. I mean, it's this ongoing, I absolutely love the approach as well.
So This has been a great conversation. I'm sure that everybody who's listening is going to get a lot out of it. And I really appreciate explaining some of these things, because I think that sometimes when you hear somebody say it works, then there's the assumption that we're doing something wrong and undervaluing all these other things besides recovery, the connection and all these changes that can take place. And then when you look at that 70% number, maybe like people who are seeing themselves in the 30%, they might actually be in the 70% now with the way we just talked about it, right? Like maybe their loved one did try out treatment once.
And here's the tricky thing about, I definitely appreciate evidence-based work for sure, but we are looking at averages. We're looking at, we're trying to step back and see bigger pictures. And yet averages can never be applied to individuals. So this work and being able to step into it and practice it, and the sense of what this looks like for you. Even if we're talking about things as biology and chemistry with medications, and some of the, Tylenol works for most people, but not for everybody. There's these things that eating bread works for most people, but not everybody. There's individual variations, and when we're talking about how we live this, that's actually what matters. So for folks that are in that, using that shiny number, for the 30% of the folks that didn't have their loved one enter into treatment, it doesn't mean that they were doing something wrong. It doesn't mean that they weren't doing it correctly. There will never be an approach that's 100%. And it also is a question about what are we tracking? If somebody is actually feeling better about how they show up in that situation, I think that is more important than whether their loved one gets into an intake and one counseling session afterwards. So I definitely appreciate the evidence-based practice, because then we're not just making things up about butterflies, but also really when we're talking about the application of this, I want to hold that very, very lightly, if you will, because we can't make that jump. So Stephen Hayes has a really phenomenal different talks and writings about at the end of normal. So Dr. Stephen Hayes from the acceptance commitment therapy world, and really actually talks about how we can't apply averages to individuals. So in case I don't think we quite have time to dive into that particular pool there, but in case either you or listeners are interested,
okay.
I'm very wary of that gap.
So is there anything else that you feel we left that's really important to say before we wrap up? I know there's so much.
There's so much. I just really want to offer appreciation to everyone who is listening and is trying to do what they can to walk this incredibly difficult situation in a way that is meaningful to you. There's so much here, and skills to try, and groups to go to, and podcast. There's just so much that's there, and yet there's also so much around that's really, really difficult. It tends to be chaotic and often. So whatever it is that you're doing to be able to find the meaningful place to put your next step, I just really respect that and appreciate that. I also really appreciate, Heather, you're making space for conversations like these and doing the work that you do. So we have lots of connection outside of this as well. And every time that you show up in one of the various Zoom rooms that we're in, I'm always really, really glad to see you there, because your perspective and your wisdom and your holding of this knowledge and of your experience and that of Elena, I really like being around it. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for giving your time to this conversation, and for the Helping Families Help website, and just all you do for the community, and how much it's helped me over the last year and it's helped me help more people. It's helped me show up better, to have that support of a community of people who are working with craft and ITC. Like that extra energy it gives me helps me put out a podcast in a week that I wouldn't be able to, and really show up. So I appreciate what you're doing for this community too, and your time today.
Be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to learn more about my work, go to heatherrosscoaching.com. If you want to help other parents who are struggling with a child's addiction, you can do it 2 different ways. First, you can share the podcast with them directly, or you can share it on your social media. Second, you can leave a review. Talk to you next week.